Here we are. Results are final. We have a new mayor in the city of Chicago. It is Brandon Johnson. The final numbers right now, we're shooting this on election night, is 51-49 with rounding. It's actually more like 3 points in reality. VBMs are going to come in. It's going to spread out. It's not going to end up there. He'll win by a little more than that, it seems like, at this point. Chris Jackowiak, our Chicago political expert, with me. I got to say, Chris, when we shot a video on February 28th, the night of the first round, we both said Johnson's going to pull this off, and then both of us changed our tune after that. Why didn't we stick with our guns?
Because Brandon Johnson did not honestly run such a good campaign, but he could afford to do that. Vallis had a lot of things going for him. He had the money advantage. He was on TV earlier, and he had a better issue: crime. Crime was the number one issue in this race, and it was in Vallis's lane. The big issue for Vallis was that he had a lot of other things he needed to overcome. Demographics, his Republican-based oppo on him. And it looks like that oppo and the demographic issues in the city of Chicago nowadays have come back to bite him in the butt from these results.
Well, you mentioned it's a numbers game. I mean, we talked about the demographics of the city of Chicago. We talked about this in the time leading up to Election Day, where Vallis really needed to overperform significantly. And let's be honest, a center-right candidate, a white older male like Paul Vallis, doing as well as he did is a significant overperformance. He just couldn't get so far that he could break 50%.
Yeah, and that's really one of the issues here, is that while Brandon Johnson was an eminently beatable candidate, Paul Vallis's oppo on him was just too strong. If this is a race where we have somebody like Mike Quigley being that older white guy in the race, or even Pat Quinn in a runoff like this, he probably ekes out this victory over Brandon Johnson. But Paul Vallis had enough issues, be it with campaign infrastructure or just general oppo, that he was not able to overcome Brandon Johnson's demographic advantages.
I mean, I'd agree with you with Quigley. If Quigley had run, he'd be Mayor Quigley at this point. I don't know about Quinn, but I get your point. I mean, we talked a lot coming into this race about air game and ground game, and Vallis clearly ran a very good campaign in the air game. And you could see it. I mean, he was doing a great job on messaging and controlling the narrative. But the ground game, you mentioned to me, and I'll give you kudos, you mentioned to me throughout the race you had concerns about Vallis's ground game, and that's what we saw, where Brandon Johnson significantly overperformed his poll numbers because his ground game was much better. Tell us about that.
Well, here's the thing about progressives. Progressives love knocking on doors. Progressives love sending text messages. And progressives love calling their friends and voter lists to tell them to go vote for the progressive candidate. And that's something that Brandon Johnson had, not just in the runoff, but in the first round as well. Vallis, he had enough money to where he probably thought that he could just spend on TV and kind of run up field in his base areas and win this race. And we saw from some issues, like in the 21st ward, every voter I talked to in a predominantly black ward was voting for Johnson. In the 14th ward, a Latino ward, turnout was very, very low in an area that Paul Vallis was probably doing very well in. We'll have those results soon. But Vallis did not have that ground game necessary in minority areas to get the margins or the turnout he needed to win this race.
Yeah, I mean, Hispanic turnout was definitely significantly down, and Vallis was doing very well with Hispanics, but if you get a high percentage of a small group of voters, that's not enough to pull out the win. He did well with white voters in the polling. We'll have to see kind of how these ward breakdowns come down. We don't have those yet. But ultimately, looking at the results, I mean, this was fairly close. One factor or another could have turned this race. But certainly ground game, Johnson had the advantage. And we see this a lot with right-of-center candidates or center-right candidates or whatever you want to call Paul Vallis. And this happens a lot to Republicans. We're Republicans in the state of Illinois, where we don't really have ground games. When we put out text messages, it's a blast text. Somebody put out how Vallis's campaign put out 4 fairly generic text messages, bam, 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 to voters. Whereas when progressives or the Democrats run their field operations, it's an individual, it's a voter, it's a contact, it's actual door-to-door, knocking on doors, making calls, sending texts. It's human interaction. It isn't just paid outreach, which is what Republicans tend to do. And so we saw a little bit of that play out in this Vallis race as well.
And you saw that specifically when it came to the endorsements. Paul Vallis got a lot of key endorsements in this race. Jesse White, a lot of black aldermen and elected officials. Bobby Rush endorsed him. And yet, even despite all of those liaisons that they were able to get, they weren't able to market them directly to the voters to where that would actually make a difference in this race. We will have the actual demographic breakdown once the ward data and the precinct data comes out, but from what it looks like right now, they weren't able to get the numbers necessary, even with the key endorsements they got, shot to win this race.
So yet another reminder that, that TV ad with Durbin, with Jesse White, that was powerful. That was a great ad. They clearly, I give kudos to Vallis's team. They ran an excellent air game in this race, but yet another reminder that you need an air game and a ground game to win campaigns. And for whatever reason, we tend to overfocus on the air game and we skip what's an equally important aspect, which is the ground game.
Well, and that's going to be the lesson going forward for a lot of center-right candidates, especially in the city of Chicago. Brandon Johnson's not going to be going away for 4 years, and he's going to have the teachers union and a number of other people within the Cook County Democratic Party who are going to be making moves during his administration. Something to keep in mind if you're on the other side of campaigns against those people is that you cannot forget about the ground game. You need to invest in the ground. You need to invest in areas where you can gain voters. And if you do not, you are going to lose that race.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Brandon Johnson. Obviously, he's going to be the next mayor. I've got to imagine he feels pretty emboldened. He doubled down on his base strategy. It barely worked, but it did work. He's going to be mayor. They've got to feel, him and his progressive backers have to feel really empowered and emboldened coming out of this win. Generally in politics, that's not a good sign, because when you come into office, you're supposed to moderate and come to the middle. I don't see Brandon Johnson doing that, not him or his backers. I feel like they're going to triple down on their progressive policies. What do you think? You think that's accurate?
Well, one of the interesting things you saw, Collin, was in a couple weeks leading up to this race, especially from national media outlets, they were talking about the fact that Brandon Johnson was not running away from the progressive message. And this is going to be a blueprint in places across the country for progressives that you can win if you are a progressive, if you stick to your beliefs and you stick to your guns. Now, is that going to work everywhere? No, they probably are going to overcompensate for this and think they can win everywhere off this message, but it worked here, and they're certainly going to feel emboldened by this. Second point, going into City Hall, we're already seeing some maneuvers from the aldermanic side of things. They just passed a big aldermanic independence ordinance at the last City Council meeting. That's going to be big if they can pass it again once Johnson's administration starts, because you are going to have a more independent City Council who is probably, based on the endorsements that Paul Vallis got, going to be in opposition to a lot of Mayor Johnson's goals and endeavors. So I'm not going to say this is 1983 council wars again, but you are going to see a split at City Hall regarding the council and Johnson while he's mayor of Chicago.
Well, and assuming the strategy worked, I got to tell you, the demographics are what put Brandon Johnson in office. He underwhelmed in the campaign, but he still was able to pull it off because the demographics, the ideological splits of the city just played to his advantage. So it's one of those things where you don't have to run the perfect campaign to win all the time, and Johnson just proved that. So if they do feel emboldened in other cities to run the same strategy, this worked in the city of Chicago because it is so deep blue. It's not going to work in other places that aren't that deep blue, but if they want to make that mistake, then it's not our problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really it for now, Collin. If you have anything else...
No, you know what? I think it's time. It's election night. We're tired. We got drinks and cigars upstairs. So, Chris, thanks for your insights throughout this race. I appreciate it, buddy.
All right, thanks, Collin. Thank you for having me.
We'll be watching Chicago moving forward.